So what we want to talk about next is about the exchange rate regime. So basically there are two extreme regimes. One is called the fixed exchange rate regime, and the other is called the floating exchange rate regime. Under the fixed exchange rate regime, the government will frequently intervene in the market to maintain a fixed exchange rate regime. So then, because government do so we will observe that the exchange rate will not fluctuate quite a lot when the economy faces a fixed exchange rate regime. However, if the government or the economy adopts a floating exchange rate regime, it means that the government makes no effort in affecting the exchange rate. Then we are going to see the exchange rate in fact fluctuate quite a lot over time, even in every minute. Therefore, you may ask, so there are two exchange rate regimes, but we know sometimes the exchange rate will change a bit, but it will not be fixed all the time, and it will not be fluctuating all the minutes. So then, is there any regime in between? And the answer is yes. So then we have different regimes in between the fixed and floating. The floating exchange rate regime is that the government makes no effort at all to affect the exchange rate. For the fixed exchange rate regime, it means that the government do quite a lot in maintaining an exchange rate that is almost fixed, seldom change. And then so in between we have different regimes that draw the spectrum that range from increasingly float to increasingly fixed. The most floating one, that is the floating exchange rate regime, is called the independently float. So the independently float means that there is almost no intervention in the exchange rate market by the government, so that the exchange rate will float independently. Then if we increase some the government intervention, then we call it the managed float. That is, it is floating, but then somehow the government intervene in the market a little bit, such that the floating is not that frequent. Then when we increase the fixed further, we call it the crawling peg. And then there is also something called the peg with the horizontal bands. So it's basically a kind of the peg. So when it is a pegging, it means that it's more fixed. And then to the extreme, that the country can adopt a currency board. For example, in Hong Kong, that it says that for $1, they assure that you can exchange for 4.3 of the Hong Kong dollar. So that is government set it, and then you just can exchange for whatever amount you want. So that is called the currency board. That is more like the fixed exchange rate regime. So then, why some countries choose to have the independent float, while some countries are willing or prefer to choose a fixed exchange rate regime, that is, for example, a currency board. So what is the disadvantage and advantage for a fixed exchange rate regime? So the fixed exchange rate regime, in fact, have a couple advantages. For example, the exchange rate will be very stable, so then it will make the international trade much easier, because the firms will be better estimate how much they are going to get when they sell the goods. So it makes the trade easier. And then also it's also serve as a commitment technology for the government to resist excessive expansionary monetary policy. Because if you promise to have a fixed exchange rate regime, or if you choose to have a fixed exchange rate regime, you cannot print too much money, because when you print too much money, your price level will raise quite a lot, and there is no way that the currency should be fixed. It will devaluate. Therefore, the advantage of a fixed exchange rate regime is that it will be able to help the government to resist the expansionary monetary policies. Because of that, when you resist the expansionary monetary policies, it means that your domestic price level will be consistent with the foreign inflation rate. And then so for firms, it's easier for them to predict what will be the future inflation, because if they know that the foreign price increases, then they know that their domestic price will increase. If the foreign price falls, then the domestic price will fall for sure, because the exchange rate remains the same. So then it seems that the fixed exchange rate is a good exchange rate regime, that it provides some stability and it regulates the governments not to have excessive expansionary monetary policy. But then why some countries still choose to have a floating exchange rate? Or why sometimes a government will abandon a fixed exchange rate regime? That is because if the foreign price increase quite a lot, then if you adopt a fixed exchange rate regime, then it means that you anchor your domestic price inflation to the foreign price. If the price increase quite a lot, you are going to have your domestic price increase quite a lot as well. Therefore, that is the great disadvantage of the fixed exchange rate regime. That is, if the foreign price increase quite a lot, then the domestic price will increase quite a lot. And that is exactly what happened in the 1970s. So before the 1970s, the US inflation rate is moderate. So then under the Bretton Woods Agreement, a lot of countries adopt the fixed exchange rate versus the US dollar. But then in the 1970s, due to the Vietnamese War, that U.S. government started to print a lot of money, and domestically in U.S. that they start to have high inflation rate. Then when the rest of the country, they adopt the fixed exchange rate vis-a-vis the U.S. dollar, they are importing the U.S. inflation rate. Therefore, in the 1970s, later on in the 72 or 73, then all the countries gradually abandoned the Bretton Woods Agreement, and then the exchange rate start to flow. So that is the big disadvantage of the fixed exchange rate. The second disadvantage of the fixed exchange rate is that for a country will lose its monetary autonomy when they adopt the fixed exchange rate regime. That is because the monetary policy will be an instrument that the government can do to stimulate the economy sometimes, especially in the short run under the Keynesian view. And then so if you adopt the fixed exchange rate regime, it means that you cannot print the money to stimulate the economy, because when you print the money, then you are going to experience the price increase. Then the price increase will imply that the domestic currency are going to devalue. But if you adopt a fixed exchange rate, you cannot allow that kind of thing to happen. Therefore, if you adopt a fixed exchange rate regime, then somehow you no longer can use the monetary policy as an instrument to stimulate the economy. So then that is the big disadvantage of the fixed exchange rate regime, because you lose the monetary autonomy. And that is exactly what happened to the European countries. When they adopt the euro, they somehow forgive their monetary autonomy, because they no longer can use the monetary policy to stimulate the economy. So here comes the Mundell's Trilemma, which describe the difficulties or the dilemma a government face when they are thinking about the advantage of the fixed exchange regime. We know that when we adopt the fixed exchange rate regime, then we are going to have a stable exchange rate, and it makes the international trade easier, and a lot of countries like that. However, when we adopt the fixed exchange rate regime, then we somehow forgot the monetary autonomy. And if you want to keep your monetary autonomy, then you need to forego the free capital movement. Because if you want to keep the monetary autonomy, for example, you decided to print more money to stimulate your economy due to recession, then the fixed exchange rate regime tells us that it may not be able to hold, because the market will say, well, the government prints more money and the currency value are supposed to fall. And then so even though the government maintains the fixed exchange rate, what is of my best interest? Well, it's of my best interest to keep more of the foreign currency right now, so that when the value falls eventually, I will not be able to lose the value of my currency because I already hold the foreign currency. Then so what I want to do is that now I want to get more of the foreign currency, and that is associated with the capital movement. If the country allows free capital movement, the currency will move out of the country, or the people will start to get more of the foreign currency, and they sell more of domestic currency. And then this makes the government to have a pressure to forego the fixed exchange rate regime, because they used to be fixed, but then a lot of people are selling the domestic currency, and then the currency value are supposed to fall. With a lot of the capital movement, it will causes the fixed exchange rate regime to fail. So then what the government can do is that they say, well, there's no free capital movement. So then you are not going to be able to sell the domestic currency in exchange of the foreign currency. And then in that case, I will be able to maintain the fixed exchange rate while keeping my monetary autonomy. Therefore, we argue that according to Mundell's observation, he claimed that there exists a trilemma, that is the fixed exchange rate regime, monetary autonomy, and the free capital movement cannot exist at the same time. When you adopt two of them, you need to forego the third. For example, if you want to keep the monetary autonomy and fixed exchange rate regime, then you need to give up the free capital movement, and you need to have the capital control. Or you have free capital movement, you keep the monetary autonomy, then you should not adopt the fixed exchange regime. Or if you want to keep the fixed exchange rate regime while keeping the free capital movement, then you have to forego the monetary autonomy. So that is the famous Mundell trilemma, that is monetary autonomy, fixed exchange rate regime, and free capital movement cannot exist at the same time. You need to forego one to get the other two.